Guys, Margaret. Oh, sorry. Oh, all right. So thank you guys. Welcome back for this last 35 minutes or so. I'm going to talk very briefly about the foundations for the roadmap. I said I'd do that before break, and it turns out I lied to you. I apologize for that. And then we'll talk about virtue. I know that many of you, your project is probably going to be more in the lines of deliberation, and others more in the lines of virtue. So if you feel like I'm going to be doing something virtue-based, worry less about the deliberation. If you're doing deliberation, worry less about the virtue. So I'll just say a few things about virtue, but please, once again, if you got questions, I could talk about this for a full semester and do in one of my courses. And I do love it. I forgot to bring my I actually have a hoodie for the Stoics, the Stoa. That one of my friends got me in my defense. And I always tell my students, like, who study a lot of theories, we only have one that, like, I have a sweatshirt for. So you should be even more skeptical about what I say here than you are everywhere else. And I would say the same things to you. So when I talk about that, be even more skeptical. But I will say, so I did want to talk about, I think it's important for those of you coming here, we talk less about this to the students, but I think it's important for you guys to know that this wasn't just something that we made up. And as Shirley was asking excellent questions earlier, it's not, the roadmap is not meant to direct you one way or the other. So when we look at constraints, for those that have read any of Immanuel Kant's writings, he thought that's what all of ethics was. And we only look at really all these other things to break ties, in essence. And you could use the roadmap and think that those are so significant that they're hardly ever outweighed. John Stuart Mill, who we read, and Mosey, who we do not, from the Chinese tradition, were consequentialists. They thought all of ethics came down to consequences. But as I alluded to at the beginning, even they recognize that that doesn't mean that everyone should make a consequential analysis every time. They're going to look at constraints as more of like rules of thumb, right? Like, why do we not lie? Because most of the time the consequence is worse than we lie, right? But then in extreme situations, we look at the consequences. If you've ever read Kungzi, or as he's more commonly known in the Western world of Confucius, whole interesting story behind that, right? It's an amazing story where all these Western scholars read his work and said, wow, he's so smart, this is so important, let's give him a Latin name. There's this really interesting backhanded compliment to that, right? But he thought that all of this was really about the roles that we play and our special obligations, and that's the way we got virtue, and that's where our constraints come from, and that's what makes the world better. And then, as we're going to talk about here at the end, character, and focusing on, as Aaron's question asked, I'm guessing many of you will focus in your projects much more on character than anything. What kind of people do we want to be? And that was really Aristotle's question, as well as Plato's in that picture as well, and Epictetus and Stockdale. And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about now. So there are foundations behind this, and it isn't meant to give you just one answer. But if you hear someone talking about like Kantian reasoning or deontological reasoning, they're really looking more at constraints, consequential reasoning, which comes right out of consequences, kind of role-based obligations or special obligations, or obligations out of structure, or familial piety. Those are kind of Kungzi, and then kind of virtue. And we do talk a lot about virtue, as it says, the third of our class. We talk about Aristotle and Epictetus and stuff. Sadly, we don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but I do want to talk a little bit about that. Okay, so Stoicism and Aristotle on arete. It's really, I don't know why it's in parentheses. It's because I can't help but say that the Stoics are right. Okay, so my students don't know this because they're too young and they don't have musical appreciation. But if you want to remember Aristotle in like 5 words, it's just to think about what Frank Sinatra, and he actually stole everything from Dizzy Gillespie, would say about this famous philosophical debate about doing and being. So Augustine thought, like, you had to be first in order to do things, and Sartre thought that the only way to be is to do. Does anyone know how Frank Sinatra and Dizzy Gillespie would come down in this debate between do, be, Doobie-doobie. Exactly, right? And that's what Aristotle thought, doobie-doobie-doo. If you want to be something, do it, right? And if you want to do it, be it. And my students, I immediately ask my students, like, if you want to be courageous, how do you become courageous? You do courageous things. You want to do courageous things, how do you do it? You be courageous, right? And then they immediately recognize that that's a circle. I tell, the analogy I use is it's more like a parking garage ramp, right? So you're always moving up or down. I think this is actually a really significant insight that we talk to our students about. And I think it's a really fundamental insight on the human condition. It's the reason we're still reading Aristotle 2.5 centuries later, or 2.5 millennia later. You are never staying the same with respect to your character. If you're honest over the course of a month, then you've inculcated that character more. And the reason why it's so important early, Plato says the beginning is the most important part of the work, is you're inculcating those habits, right? You know, I recognize, you know, if you get in the habit of stopping for a coffee or stopping at 7-Eleven on the drive onto the yard, right, it's very easy for that to become a habit. And you're doing it all the time. So that's what Aristotle thinks that character is about. It's about doing these things. You do the right thing. Eventually, you'll start doing it for the right reasons. You'll do it reliably and habitually, and then you'll start feeling the right way. So Aristotle says, no single swallow makes a spring. Example I talk to my students through is running, right? You know, you see me running across the yard, that doesn't make me a runner, right? They recognize that right away. But we talk about how you have to do it for the right reasons. You have to do it again and again, and then you have to love it. There is a really interesting question. So this actually should build. I made it a little bit faster. You know, this is something I think we have to think more about, and I encourage all of you to think about it as well. I was thinking about the role of referees in sports after talking to many of you. Oftentimes we do things for reasons of justice and fairness that end up making this more difficult, right? So if I have someone external forcing me to do the right thing, Jim was talking about like the honor code, right? That might make me much more likely to do the right thing, but it might be much harder then for me to do it for the right reason. If I have a referee calling balls and strikes, it might just make it harder for me to have that kind of accountability that a lot of you are talking about. And that's important to recognize. This isn't automatic. It's not like every time that you run, you become a runner. Lord knows the Air Force forced me to run for many years. And then they also forced me to shave. And it turns out as soon as they stopped forcing me to do both of those things, I stopped both of those things. And so we do those for good moral reasons. It's not like we insert referees for arbitrary reasons. It makes the games fairer than if you're calling your own fouls, if you ever played like a pickup game of basketball, right? But it does hurt this cycle that Aristotle thinks is really important, or maybe like it a little bit less likely for us to kind of go through all these steps, that we do the right thing, and then we start doing it for the right reasons, and then we do it again and again, and then we start loving it. Questions on that?
I was just thinking when you talked about, you know, loving as you get there. One of the things I'm going to do a little coaches meeting today. One of the things I'm going to talk about is loving the process. And late Kobe Bryant, late in his career, was being interviewed, and the reporter said, well, you know, after practice you do 100 free throws, right? And she basically said, well, you're Kobe Bryant, you've got multiple rings, you're all, why would you do that? And he said, because that's the process, and I love the process, right? So that's how I kind of look at this a little bit, is that as you know, with proper feelings is, I think, loving the process, right?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, loving it all, right?
Loving it all. It's all
yeah.
part. It's not just the games, it's the weightlifting, it's the conditioning,
yeah.
everything.
Yeah, because otherwise you're very much less likely to do it, right? And you're not going to certainly do it appropriately if you don't have that feeling for it. It is an interesting question how these steps can misfire and how this cannot lead to these. I don't know if anyone's a fan of The Good Place. but they just assume that this is the way it works. If you watch the show, right, they just say this is the way it works, right? You just do the right thing, and then eventually you'll get the right motive. I think that there's a lot of truth to that. That doobie do, you know, act as if ye have faith, and faith will be given to ye. I think there's a lot of truth to that, but there are certainly limitations. Some of that might be because this process gets laid out. The Stoics would give another limitation. I assume everyone knows what these two pictures are? Like that, yes?
Yeah.
2020 graduation and I-Day for the class of 2024, right? So the Stoics would say, listen, you can't always like prepare for like the Farsi, like you just can't prepare for every situation. And so what you should do is get your beliefs about what's right and good and valuable set up first, and then you'll be more adaptable. And so one example that I think is really quick and easy here is, you know, I used to get really upset when people would cut me off on the road. And so I followed like a life hack that someone said, well, you should write this down. Every time it happens, you should write it down. You should say how long you got upset for, what happened, right? And what you're going to do next time. Now, here's something that's true about that. Like the perfect virtuous person would never keep that diary, right? Because they would never get upset on the road in the first place. So there might be things that you have to do that you do because you're not there yet. And they're not acting like you're there yet. And so when you think about virtue or habits, it's going to be one of those two categories, or maybe both, right? Either you want them to act like they're doing it, or you want them to act differently. So in sports, the biggest difference might be like a scrimmage versus a drill, right? And in lots of activities, then they might be different. So the Stoics would say, what you need to do is you just need to get your beliefs right, and even if it doesn't appear, so everyone's seen the Mueller illusion, right? This one I like more because it's even more vivid. Or, you know, that one clearly looks longer than that one. And even once you recognize that there are actually the same length, right, you can't change your perceptions. But the Stoics would say, like, we do that all the time with things like what's valuable, right? We might recognize in a moment of clarity that like power or reputation aren't valuable, but oftentimes when push comes to shove, right, when the admiral's around, right, even though you recognize that you shouldn't care that much about reputation or anything, all of a sudden sometimes things that you do, right? I shouldn't care about, you know, public speaking. I shouldn't get nervous because I shouldn't care that much about what other random strangers think about me, but it doesn't prevent me from getting nervous before I speak publicly, right? Because it turns out when push comes to shove, I do. So the Stoics would say, what we need to do is go through exercises that that kind of build to like small things that'll help build to excellence. So this is a little meme, but and I will say one thing that I really like about I mean, there are many things I like about the Greeks, but their word for virtue and excellence are the same. And so oftentimes when we talk about virtue, I think it's helpful to recognize that what we really mean is excellence at being a human being, right? If we see people as equals, if we see people as worthy of dignity, if we act that way, if we love that and that process, right? That's what it is to be virtuous and to be excellent. And so let me just end with a couple of things. We talked a little bit about our reflection activities in NE 203, but as people are thinking about like what your project wants to be, there are lots of places that you might go. I have probably less to say about moral perception and human dignity, which I think is a really great projects, or moral injury. People want to talk more about those. I think those are great. But I would say in terms of virtue, you know, just having people reflect on specific virtues or do things to develop certain virtues can be really powerful. We make our students sit in silence and solitude. We make our students discuss the virtues with other people. We actually have them go to their company officers and talk about what makes a good officer. Those 4-starred ones are the professor can choose, or sometimes the professor lets the student choose among those 2 choices. So we sometimes ask our students to go on social media fast. I use that one. I love that. to consider fallen heroes, consider moving past some past injustice, to work on gratitude, to work on pride. In other of our classes in LEL, they discuss virtues. They develop a plan to work on a particular virtue. There are other things that we do in LEL broadly to work on virtues. So for some of our ELD classes, we have them think about stoicism and read and write. And one of the activities that I really like is, there aren't a lot of students that do this, but it's one of my favorites, is to have the students come up with epitaphs. So like, what words would you want to be remembered by after you leave, let's say, the academy or this world? Quote reflections are always great. I know people are already doing those, but thinking about doing those deliberately can be great. Debts and Lessons is one of my favorites. The first time I read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, I don't know if anyone's read this, but the whole first book is like, I want to thank these specific people for giving me these specific things. And the first few times I read it, I was like, this is like the stupid acknowledgements piece of every academic work I've ever read. Like, when do we get to like the stuff? And it took me a long time to be like, oh, this is the central part of the book, right? That he's expressing gratitude for these things and recognizing who gave him what. I know a lot of people have just people write thank you notes, like a specific, like a, not a, like a, you gave me a gift, but like, you did give me a gift, but not like a tangible thing, like what it is and why. I like this one a lot. Some people don't. It's harder to do here on the yard. You end up having to tear it up as opposed to burn it, but like write down everything that's upsetting you and then set the list on fire. Cold showers is very popular these days. I do like rereading, asking them to reread something that they've read before, to work on the virtues of being articulate and being curious. So let me just say, if you are doing your plan on moral deliberation, test of integrity can be good. We do a lot of them in our class, but moral dilemmas are always better than test of integrity. The more detailed you can make cases, the better off they are. This is a great fault with the two disciplines that I have called my own, physics and philosophy. We're far too often to make things overly simple. That can be useful at times, but the more detailed it is, the better. There's the old physics joke about assume the cow is a frictionless sphere, and then we can do real physics. If the moral deliberation roadmap works, please use it. If not, that's totally fine too. If you're doing virtues, I think specific virtues are always better than virtues in general, but that doesn't mean that the student can't provide the specifics. So it depends upon your project, but I think specifics are general. And then think about whether what you're talking about is like an Aristotelian kind of virtue, a doobie-doobie-doo, or realize your imperfections from the goal and the importance of remorse and having like, driving that to make you sick to your stomach, some combination. I will say as well, we here in I'm not just saying that because Jeff is here and he's asked me to come. I think this is an amazing program, and it's in large part because this works if it comes from you more than from me, right? It's easy to ghettoize ethics and to say, well, that's not the way things go in the real world. So words from you about why this is important in your discipline, in your sport, in your activity, in the fleet, matter way more than they do for me. But if you want me to look at something or even come and help, I can certainly be more than willing to do that. I think this is an amazing thing, and I think the more that we can have people talking about this, where the students live both academically and athletically and physically, the better. So anyway, do you guys have questions? That's just a lot of me ranting.
Did your road rage journal work?
It did. It did. I mean, I'm drawn to the Stoics in part because I need them. I'm not gonna lie, but yes, it did.
Closing comments or questions for Professor Herbert or Professor Hedel?